Hello, good morning, good afternoon, everyone, dear colleague. I think we're going to make a prompt start because we have only 1 hour and quite a lot to go through. My name is Pascal Bird, and I am the Executive Director of Legal Response International, better known as LRI. A very warm welcome to all of you joining us for our pre-Bonn briefing webinar. We will, in the next hour or so, talk to you through some of the key issues that are going to be discussed at the subsidiary bodies meeting in Bonn taking place in the next couple of weeks. Inevitably, because we have only 1 hour, this is going to be a very high-level overview of some of those main issues. However, if you're interested and wanted to dig more into the detail of some of them, we invite you to have a look at the resources section, which you will find at the end of this presentation, on the slides, the last slide, which has got a list of a number of hopefully useful resources, including a summary of the outcome of the COP29, last COP29, and some other resources as well. I will now pass over, without further ado, to my colleague Harrison, who will talk you through mitigation and nationally determined contribution and the mitigation work program. Harrison, over to you.
Thank you, Pascal. So as Pascal said, I'm Harrison. I'm a legal intern at LRI. I've been here for just over a year. So I will be going through the mitigation part of this meeting, and I'll also be going over technology later on in the meeting. So on mitigation, I will start off by going over what mitigation is. We'll also then take a look at nationally determined contributions and their relation with the global stocktake. We will then look at the new or updated NDCs from this year. We will then move on to an agenda item called NDC features, which was discussed at COP29, and we will finish off with the mitigation work program. So mitigation refers to all efforts to reduce emissions released into the atmosphere and reducing the current concentration of carbon dioxide, mostly by enhancing sinks which capture existing carbon dioxide. So efforts to reduce emissions include renewable energies, for instance, and sinks refer more to increasing forest cover or increasing ocean capture. And this comes from the idea that there is a direct relation between the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and global average temperatures. So this led to the main procedural obligation of the parties under the Paris Agreement and its long-term goals, which is contained in Article 4.2 of the Paris Agreement, which is that parties submit nationally determined contributions. They must maintain and update mitigation objectives within these NDCs, as they are called, and they must submit them every 5 years. This obligation started in 2020 with a 10-year horizon. So the objectives, the NDC submitted in 2020 had an objective for 2030, etc. They tend, and increasingly so, to include other elements, including adaptation or loss and damage, and they are not an obligation towards a specific outcome. So this is important. There's no kind of international obligation, but they fulfill these NDCs. They simply must strive to achieve them. This does not mean that at the national level there might not be obligations. And so importantly on this, and why it's relevant really at the moment is because new NDCs were to be submitted by February 10th, 2025. NDCs were a big part also of the global stocktake, as I mentioned. So the first global stocktake, which took place in Dubai, recognized that parties were not currently on track to meet the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement. So the global stocktake, just kind of a brief overview of the global stocktake. Montserrat will talk more about it later on, but it's a snapshot of parties' global progress towards implementation of the goals of the Paris Agreement. And so this first global stocktake recognized that parties were not on track, and it also reaffirmed that successive NDCs must represent a progression beyond current NDCs and reflect highest possible ambition. And so the first GST created, in light of this kind of recognition, but there was not enough progress, it created an annual GST dialogue to facilitate the sharing of knowledge and good practices on how GST1 could inform the preparation of parties' next round of NDCs. Quite a mouthful, but generally referred to as the GST NDC annual dialogue. So it was held at SV60 as a 2-day mandated event, the first one, so last year in June, where it mostly focused on process and it didn't really touch on substantive elements. This then led to COP29, where there were really quite divergent views on the content of the summary report from the dialogue. So the Secretariat prepared a summary report from that dialogue, and a lot of parties had very different views on what to actually do with this report, whether it should simply be a factual summary of the discussions or it should reflect knowledge, experiences, and good practices. And there was also quite fundamentally disagreement on whether this dialogue should continue or not, especially given that NDCs will have been submitted or should have been submitted by SV62, so in June, as they were supposed to be submitted by February. As such, Rule 16 of the draft rules of procedures was applied, meaning that the agenda item would return at SV62 and later on at COP30. There were, however, informal consultations held on this on the 30th of April, where to prepare for the second dialogue, so which is taking place at SV62, among the kind of important suggestions, let's say, was the suggestion of combining this dialogue with the expert dialogue on mountains and climate change, as well as the children and climate change dialogue, and kind of making a big dialogue called the GST NDC dialogue. In any case, it will still go ahead at SV62 on the 19th and 20th of June, where they will discuss how the GST outcome is informing the updating, preparation, and implementation of NDCs across all thematic areas, while integrating cross-cutting elements. There'll also be a roundtable on advancing NDC implementation and enabling environments. And the dialogue, there'll also be on the side of this discussions on whether the dialogue should continue and what to do with the report of the dialogue. As I mentioned, the kind of other important why we're talking really about NDCs this year, most importantly, is because they were supposed to be submitted by February 10th, 2025, new NDCs setting objectives through to 2035. However, only 16 countries met the deadline. Eventually, Simon Steele, the executive secretary of the UNFCCC, announced a new deadline for September to ensure that these NDCs could be taken into account for COP30. Among these 16 NDCs, there's really a mix of developed and developing countries, representing around 25% of global emissions. A new report, a fairly recent report by the World Resources Institute on general trends of these NDCs, revealed that nearly all of these NDCs include 2035 mitigation measures, which is obviously very positive. However, they did not strengthen their 2030 targets, despite the ability to kind of strengthen these if they wanted to. They also noticed an increase in prioritizing adaptation over mitigation, which is surprising given that NDCs are really supposed to, or at least at their source, be focused on mitigation. And importantly, they believe that based on the 22 NDCs submitted at the time of creating this report, it was insufficient to reach the 1.5 degrees goal and quite unlikely to achieve the 2 degrees goal. On, as I mentioned, NDC features, this is an agenda item which I'm going to go over fairly quickly, but it's basically a decision 1 CP21, which is a decision that adopted the Paris Agreement, requested the ad hoc working group of the Paris Agreement to develop further guidance on features of NDCs. This was to be considered, and these features were to be considered and adopted at CMA1, which was in 2018 in Katowice. These were discussed, but there were really quite strong disagreements back at CMA1. And so the parties decided that this should be kind of pushed forward or pushed later back at least, all the way until COP29 CMA6, which was obviously in Baku in November, where the same divergences reappeared. And I have not got time to go through them all now, but you can find them in our summary report of COP29. Parties essentially decided to push this back to CMA8 in 2026. And so finally coming to the mitigation work program, which is parties established this as the mitigation ambition and implementation work program to urgently enhance mitigation ambition and implementation in 2021 at CMA3 in Glasgow. In 2022, the format and the scope of a mitigation work program were defined, as it was called then, the Sharm el-Sheikh mitigation work program, where they emphasize facilitative, non-prescriptive outcomes, specifically respecting national sovereignty and circumstances of countries. In 2023, in Dubai, tensions started to kind of build on this, especially with the overlaps of the GST, which took place, the global stocktake, which took place in Dubai, which led eventually to all of the substantive outcomes being incorporated into the global stocktake and the mitigation work program being essentially procedural. Finally, at COP29 in Baku, the discussions were really quite tense. Again, the main area of tension being whether the mitigation work program should address metrics and mitigation gaps identified in the COP28 decision on the global stocktake. Essentially, whether the global stocktake outcomes should guide the mitigation work program. Eventually, thanks to quite considerable work by the presidency, consensus was reached in this, at least on one specific point, on the idea of establishing a digital platform to connect mitigation initiatives and projects with potential investors, focusing on implementation rather than increasing mitigation ambition. Ahead of SV62, parties and stakeholders were invited to submit views on the design and features of this platform, with a view to exchanging on these views at SV62, which will be the main subject of discussions on the mitigation work program. They'll also, on the side, consider progress in implementing the dialogue. And finally, there's a kind of a small note on this. There's also 2 dialogues which are held in 2025 as established by CMA4 on the mitigation work program. The one that took place in May 2025 in Panama focused on the kind of forest sector and mitigation in the forest sector. Thank you. I will now pass over to my colleague on adaptation section.
Many thanks, Harrison. Mics are all off, as you can probably see at the moment, but we will take questions at the end of the presentations. There hopefully will be 10-15 minutes for questions. That at that point, mics will be turned back on. And if you have any question, just raise your hand or put it in the chat, and we will try and address them as they come. Thank you. I will now briefly talk about adaptation. So what do we mean by adaptation? In the climate change context, adaptation is usually understood as adjustment in processes and practices and structure that can reduce harm or also take advantage of opportunities associated with changes in the climate. It applies to different systems and spheres, so the ecological, the social, socio-cultural, economic sphere, etc. Some of the measures that it requires can be global, but often it is very local and context specific. It can also be reactive or anticipatory too. Adaptation has long been recognized as a necessary complement to mitigation action and a very necessary and key component of the global response to climate change. And indeed, adaptation is recognized in the Framework Convention on Climate Change, including amongst its objective and Article 4. But it is also true that the convention was and is very largely mitigation centric. And so as a result of that, countries, and particularly developing countries who have been most affected by the impacts of climate change, have long advocated for parity between mitigation and adaptation. This is just to indicate, to show you what is often referred to as the iterative cycle of adaptation, which include assessing its impact, vulnerability, then planning for adaptation, then implementing adaptation measures and adjustments, and then, of course, monitoring and evaluating adaptation action. And I will come back to that again later on. As I was saying, the convention was largely mitigation centric, and developing countries in particular were advocating for a redress in the balance and more attention to be given to adaptation. And to some extent, this was achieved through the Paris Agreement, which contains its own dedicated article on adaptation. In particular, paragraph 1 of the Article 7 establishes the GGA, or the Global Goal on Adaptation, of enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability to climate change, with view to contributing to sustainable development, ensuring an adequate adaptation response in the context of the temperature goal of Article 2 of the Paris Agreement. So this provision was good insofar as it did establish a goal. However, it did not otherwise try to quantify the goal in any aspect or expand on its qualities. So if it was to be more than just a symbolic or an aspirational goal, it needed to be fleshed out. And this is what has been taking place in the more recent past. So in terms of more recent development that have taken place, the first one to start operationalizing this goal took place in 2021 at COP26 with the launch of the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program on the GGA. So this work program was aimed at developing a framework to track and measure progress on adaptation. This was then followed 2 years later by the establishment of the UAE framework for global climate resilience that established both thematic and dimensional targets. So thematic targets in key areas such as water, food, infrastructure, poverty eradication, health, ecosystems, etc. And then 4 dimensional targets or process targets that are linked to the iterative adaptation cycle that I showed you earlier. The same COP also established a UAE BELEM work program, so another work program to basically develop the indicators to track progress on those targets. This work program is set to conclude in Belém. So in Baku at the end of last year at COP29/CMA6, parties discussed a number of things. First of all, the process of indicator developments. There had been identifying existing indicators, but also mandating a large group of experts to develop new indicators for measuring progress towards those targets. The discussion in Baku also covered the timeline for the work up to COP30, which is happening this year at CMA8, with quite a number of meeting and a workshop taking place of experts to continue the work on consolidating, identifying and consolidating these indicators. The discussion also covered guidance to both the experts and the chairs of the SBs on various methodology approaches and criteria for these indicators. It also talks more at length about the expected outcome and output of the work program. And then more generally discussed as well the role of the GGA in relation to the global Stocktake process that Harrison mentioned earlier, and how the two can be aligned, as well as talking about the concept of transformational adaptation, and potentially how this concept could be integrated into the GGA framework. So the decision that then was adopted at COP29, CMA6, basically reaffirmed the request to the expert to refine this process of mapping existing indicators and developing new one, provide further guidance to ensure that there are common methodologies and also additional criteria to ensure transparent monitoring of progress. In addition to avoid imposing additional burdens, in particular on developing countries, the parties also agreed that the final outcome should consist of a manageable set of indicators, to no more than 100 indicators. So where are we at now? So so further to the COP29, there has been intersessional work, as I mentioned, with virtual meeting and workshop ahead of the Bonn meeting happening now in June. And so as a result of that, it's expected that in June, the parties will consider the outputs from this intersessional work, including an existing consolidated list of about just under 500 indicators, as well as a technical report by the Secretariat and reports by the expert, towards finalizing this list of indicators, which should take place at CMA7, so in Belém at the end of this year. One important aspect of this work as well is how what's called means of implementation, by which parties normally refer mean finance as well as technology and capacity building, how those means of implementation might be integrated in the GGA framework. It being understood that these means of implementation will be key to implement the framework, and the COP, the decision that was taken at COP29 CMA6 actually decided that the final outcome of this work program should include some indicators, quantitative and qualitative indicators, for enabling factors for implementation, including those means of implementation. The COP29 also launched a Baku adaptation roadmap to support implementation of various aspects of the GGA framework and to develop modalities for work on the roadmap. So more work will be taking place on that, as well as on reporting on progress towards those targets. Very important, of course, to make sure that there is a reporting process in place. And as I said earlier, that this reporting process should not increase the burden already, the high burden already on countries for reporting, and that also all the data that is necessary for this reporting is clear and understood and available to parties. And amongst other key topics to be discussed will be transformational adaptation and this concept and how it might fit into more broadly into the GGA framework. So this is a quick whistle tour of expectations for the GGA at SB 62, and in terms of other topics that will be covered, parties will also on adaptation. The other three agenda items that will be included will be continuing consideration of the review of the progress and effectiveness and performance of the Adaptation Committee, which was started at a previous COP and the SBs. There is at COP29, parties could not agree if this review should take place under the authority of the COP or under the authority of the COP and the CMA. And so it is expected that this issue will again crop up at SB 62. If you're interested in finding out more about this issue of governance, in particular of the committee, we have produced some advice on that, and which we can share with you, or you can find on our database, which is available from our website. One other topic that is due to be covered is national adaptation plans, and again, continuing consideration of an assessment of the progress in formulating and in implementing national adaptation plans, which was an area where parties did not make much progress at the last meeting at the COP, because first of all, they could not agree on what text should be the basis of the negotiation, and spent a lot of time, in particularly in the first week, in debating that. Then eventually found a compromise and decided on a text and engaged in substantive discussion, including on whether to include an obligation on the part of developed countries to provide means of implementation to developing countries for the formulation and implementation of MAP. This is a big, an important call on the part of developing countries who have been saying consistently that without support from developed countries, they struggle with formulating, let alone implementing these very important national implementation adaptation plans. Sorry. So at the end of the last session, there was no substantive decision that was taken. So consideration will continue in Bonn on this issue. And then finally on adaptation communication. So adaptation communication are one of the means for parties to report on their priorities, implementation, and support needs, plans and actions, etc., in relation to adaptation. Article 7.10 of the Paris Agreement says that each party should submit and update periodically adaptation communication. And so parties have been encouraged to do so. back at CMA 1 some guidance on how parties submitted these, what those adaptation communications should contain, and how parties submitted, etc., was established. And one of the items here will be to basically review this guidance, take stock of it, and as necessary, revise it to take account of some submissions which parties have been invited to make, as well as a synthesis report of the Secretariat, which will be taken at with a view to taking a decision on this at CMA 7. So I will stop here and I will hand over to Maha, who will be talking about finance. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Maha Wendeborg, Legal Officer at LRI, and I will be discussing climate finance. So I will first explain what climate finance is, then I will continue with a debrief of COP29, what happened in Baku, and then I'll follow with the agenda for Bonn meetings and then for the next COP. So what is climate finance? In the Paris Agreement, we can find it in Article 2, Paragraph 1, Subparagraph C, which lays out the objectives of the Paris Agreement and also outlines that making financial flows consistent with pathways towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development is essential for meeting these objectives and is an objective in itself. And then in Article 9, Paragraph 1, 2, and 3, it really shows how these objectives are supposed to occur or be met. So indeed, climate finance is an objective of the Paris Agreement, and it encompasses private but also public financial flows. It also calls for increasing green finance flows to support these low emission technologies and also climate resilience, and also to phase out finance flows towards the carbon emitting technologies towards green technologies. Then it's also a means of implementation, so it means that it is necessary to meet these objectives. These financial resources have to be found. And then thirdly, it's a financial obligation put on developed countries to developing countries. So it's a commitment in the Paris Agreement that is differentiated. That means that developing states have more of a commitment to give these, make these financial resources available for developing countries. So that's found in Article 9, Paragraph 1, but it's also laid out under the convention. So Article 4, Paragraph 3 and 4, Paragraph 5 includes the support that has to be given to developing countries to meet their adaptation needs. But it's also it makes the implementation of the convention conditional to such financial support for these developing countries. Importantly, also, the decision adopting the Paris Agreement lays out a quantified finance goal. So that was set forth in the Copenhagen Accord, and it extends to 2025. And it's in order to meet these it's a financial goal to be met, a collective financial goal that developed countries must mobilize jointly $100 billion per year, both from public and private sources, for mitigation adaptation in developing countries. But importantly, this goal is often not met, and in 2021, countries urged again developing countries to deliver on this goal. And that leads to what happened in COP29. So that was very much anticipated, the new collective quantified goal, because as we've seen, the other goal was hard to be met, so we needed more ambition. And so the NCQG, how it's also called, aimed to contribute to achieving Article 2, so the objectives of the Paris Agreement, by supporting the mitigation and adaptation goals and making financial flows consistent with a pathway towards lowering greenhouse gas emissions. So it has qualitative elements, so it addresses barriers climate finance, such as including includes high capital costs, co-financing requirements, and the complex application processes. It also aims at enhancing transparency, eliminating conditionalities for access, specifically for LDCs and SIDS. And it also decides to make a significant increase of public resources that should be provided to developing countries. So they are to be provided via also these international climate funds, such as the Adaptation Fund, the Least Developed Countries Fund, and the Special Climate Change Fund. And these funds are specifically called also to enhance their access, their effectiveness, so that these funding programs can go more effectively to developing countries. And so the NCQG is also, as it says, quantified goals. So it has an important quantitative element. It sets a floor, so a minimum amount of money that has to be given annually. So $100 billion is the annual target by developed countries to provide to this fund. But then it also asks that developed countries provide at least $300 billion per year by 2035 for developing country parties for their climate actions, and also calls then on all actors. So that's really explains how climate finance is all-encompassing and includes all the different actors. So all actors, both private and public sources, have to provide at least $1.3 trillion per year by 2035. And so in doing so, it also launched, so the NCQG launched the Baku to Belém roadmap to 1.3 trillion. And that aims at scaling up climate finance to developing country parties in order, again, to support low greenhouse gas emissions, climate resilient development pathways, but also implement so the national NDCs and the NAPs, as Harrison and Pascal explained. And these also to be, so the roadmap is also to be done by or implemented through grants, concessional and non-debt creating instruments, but also measures to create fiscal space, taking into account multilateral initiatives, etc. So that is still to be discussed, as we will see afterwards. But so this NCQG decision was highly criticized, both in terms of how it was adopted. So it was adopted quite quickly, without opening the floor to comment. So that sort of questioned the lack of consensus, perhaps, on the adoption of this decision. And then substantively, some countries also criticized that it does not articulate well the obligation that developed countries have to provide climate finance as mandated in Article 9.1 of the Paris Agreement. Instead, it uses the language of 9.3 of the Paris Agreement, which is more of a call to developed countries to provide funding, and it's less stringent. And it also does not provide an explicit definition of climate finance, nor does it address key issues that would link, climate finance to human rights, but also exclude certain financial flows, and does not mention fossil fuels investments. So that, another topic that was discussed at COP29 was the Adaptation Fund, which Pascal mentioned quickly. So the Adaptation Fund is considered both under the agendas of the meeting of the Kyoto Protocol contracting parties and the CMA. It falls under Article 9.4 of the Paris Agreement, and also a decision that called on financial contributions to the Adaptation Fund, to be done by developed countries, and so that they have to double their collective provisions to developing countries between 2019 and then to 2025. So that's why this year is important. It also calls for achieving a balance between mitigation and adaptation financing. As we've seen, often the focus was on mitigation funding mitigation funds, and now it has to move also to include adaptation. And so the CMA welcomed also the Adaptation Board's initiative to also address gender challenges in funding climate action, which is also very important. And then now we're moving on to what will happen, the discussion that will happen at the Bonn meetings and then at the COP. So concerning Bonn, the Adaptation Fund will be discussed, specifically the COP requested that the subsidiary body on implementation considers the matter of the arrangements of the fund, specifically that it would only be discussed on the Paris Agreement and not the Kyoto Protocol anymore. And yes, and also making more recommendations for the next COP. In addition, there are some agenda items that will be discussed at Bonn concerning the Baku to Belém roadmap to 1.3 trillion. As I mentioned, the roadmap is quite vague still, and we need to discuss more about how it will be implemented. So there will be 3 open consultations, one with parties, one with stakeholders, and another one under the Baku Initiative for Climate Finance, Investment and Trade. Then further, so about COP, why COP 30, the next COP happening in November, why is it going to be important, or why will be discussed? Again, the Baku to Belém roadmap aims to then have a final report to be presented at the COP or the CMA. And then states have also requested the Standing Committee on Finance to prepare a report that will be considered at the CMA, specifically also on the collective progress towards the delivery of the NCQG. So that's why that's important. And then states have agreed to conducting periodic assessment on the implementation of the NCQG as part of the global stocktake, with a review of this NCQG decision in 2030, and then deliberations on its future in 2035. So it's still in development and exciting to follow. So now I will give the floor to Harrison. Thank you.
Thank you, Mara. Yes, so on technology, I'm going to start off by kind of going through what technology is, just with mitigation. I'll then go through its legal architecture. I will then run you through the technology mechanism, and I will finish off by kind of briefly going through what happened at COP29 and what will happen at SB62. So technology transfer and development specifically refers to products used to mitigate or adapt to climate change. So as I kind of said, mitigate can refer to, as I said earlier during the mitigation section, mitigation can refer to renewable energy projects, whereas adaptation can refer to early warning systems and that sort of product. So this was developed in Article 4.7 of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the Paris Agreement kind of took over and in its Article 10 further developed the technology aspect of international climate regime. It goes from the idea that technology transfer and development is seen as key to enhancing climate resilience, reducing emissions of greenhouse gases, and establishing obligations on parties to cooperate. It recognizes the importance, and specifically it recognizes the importance of transferring technologies from developed countries to developing countries, not only transferring the actual product, but also capacity building to build and successfully install and operate and maintain the technologies. This led to the technology mechanism, which was created in 2010. So at COP16, they created a technology mechanism composed of kind of 2 arms, as you can see on this diagram, with one arm being the Technology Executive Committee, which is in charge of kind of policy. It analyzes and provides recommendations on key issues surrounding technology transfer. And on the other side, they created the CTCN, the Climate Technology Center Network, which works more on implementation. It's hosted by the UN Environment Programme, where it kind of supports countries in implementing the technologies, that notably by coordinating a network of stakeholders. This developed and kind of was built on in 2015 with the Paris Agreement, which says in Article 10, paragraph 3, that the technology mechanism also serves the Paris Agreement. The Article 10, paragraph 4 then established the technology framework, which you can see at the top of the diagram, technology framework which guides the technology mechanism. So there's a few kind of guiding principles such as coherence, inclusiveness, transformational approaches, and some key themes for future action, such as implementation, enabling environment, capacity building, etc. So the technology framework guides the technology mechanism, and the technology mechanism implements the technology framework. This was further developed in 2022 and 2023, where it's starting to get a little bit more complicated so as I was saying, it's implemented by the Technology Executive Committee and the Climate Technology Centre and Network with guidance from the CMA. They decided in 2022 in Sharm el-Sheikh to COP27 that because of the kind of linkages between the tech and the CTCN, they should create a joint work program. And rather than working separately, they now work together. They also work separately, but there's a fairly important part of their work which is also joint now. So as you can see in this kind of mustard box at the bottom is the joint work program. And they've also created, in light of a decision back in 2015 related to the global stocktake, as I explained earlier, to create this technology implementation program. So the global stocktake, which ended in 2023 in Dubai, highlighted concerns surrounding insufficient funding, etc., lots of issues with the technology mechanism. And so they created this technology implementation program on the side of the technology mechanism to strengthen and support implementation of technology priorities, as well as to address the challenges identified in the first periodic assessment of the technology mechanism, which was in the global stocktake. So now that I've kind of gone through what technology transfer is and what the technology mechanism looks like, I'm going to go through quickly, conscious of time, what happened at COP29 and what will happen at SV62. So technology transfer is addressed in these kind of 4 different avenues, or at least it was at COP29 and will be at SV62. So this first one, which is really just kind of quite a general one, enhancing climate technology development and transfer. Here at COP29, they analysed a report which recognised progress in coordination between the tech and the CTCN, but they also identified the importance of parties identifying their technology needs to receive more targeted support. In light of this, they decided to conduct a review of the functions of a technology mechanism starting at SV62, so which will really be discussed here in Bonn in June, with a view to reaching a decision by CMA 7. At CMA 7, they'll also, so in Berlin, they'll also decide whether to extend the CTCN. So we can expect fairly lengthy discussions on this during Bonn. On the kind of second avenue, linkages between the technology mechanism and the framework and the financial mechanism, sorry. The financial mechanism of the convention provides financial resources to the developing countries. It has kind of the Green Global Environment Fund, Green Climate Fund, fund responding to loss and damage, etc. They recognise here the need to increase collaboration between the two, and focusing specifically on identifying barriers to accessing finance. And so at SV62, it's going to discuss, the parties are going to discuss how to turn technological priorities into fundable projects and how to increase data and information on these projects for better follow-ups. Finally, reaching the TIP, the Technology Implementation Program, as it's called. This was on the table for discussion in Baku at COP29, as it was created quite recently. Countries could not reach an agreement on this. And so it will be it's been pushed back to SV62, where it's going to be ready, the fundamentals of the technology implementation program will be decided in view of reaching a decision at CMA 7. And yeah. And so then on the Poznan strategic program on technology transfer, the PSP as it's known, this was created a long time ago in 2007, and with the idea of enabling the Global Environment Fund, the GEF, to provide funding to climate technology development and transfer activities. Given that the activities of the PSP have been completed, the discussions at COP29 focus essentially on whether this item should cease to exist or not. Eventually, countries agreed to keep the agenda item solely to be able to analyze the program and extract lessons learned to inform new programs such as the Technology Implementation Program, which will begin at SB 62. I will now hand over to Montserrat for Just Transition.
Thanks, Harrison. Hello, everyone. Instead of covering Just Transition fully, and I'll leave you the slides for you to consult later, but I will run through Just Transition, loss and damage, Article 6, and the COP process in ideally 5 to 6 minutes, just to give you a sense of what these negotiation streams are about and what's going to be happening in Bonn. Okay, so Just Transition, it doesn't have a standalone article in the Paris Agreement compared to other negotiation streams, but it's in the preamble where parties should take into account the imperatives of just transition of the workforce and the creation of decent work and quality jobs in accordance with nationally defined development priorities. Basically, the idea behind Just Transition is that the transition will have some costs for workers, but also for communities, and we should bear in mind equity and the priorities of developing countries as well when taking decisions in regards to this transition. Still, there isn't an agreed definition of just transition in the UNFCCC regime, where developed countries tend to stick to this original idea of transitioning, meaning the respect of the workforce or the condition of the workforce, and developing countries have a more comprehensive view that also relates to communities and their rights, participation, and inclusion. This is also because many times the developments happen in developing countries, like green developments happen in developing countries, and communities are affected. So Just Transition features in 2 negotiation streams, the main one being the Just Transition work program, which was established in 2022, and response measures, which is the sort of original idea of how the convention should address the costs of the measures that we take to respond to climate change, mainly in mitigation. And so response measures has been around longer in 2011, but it has a more narrow scope compared to Just Transition. The Just Transition work program, as I said, was established in 2022, further developed in 2023, and this is why now it's called UAE Just Transition Work Program. And it's where the mode of work was agreed. What's happening now is that parties, as I say, in that work program, they establish all of these elements for Just Transition, and you can see they go well beyond workforce. They cover adaptation, they cover international cooperation, the nationally defined development priorities, etc. And so, but despite being quite comprehensive in the elements, the scope of the Just Transition work program and the definition of Just Transition still is not agreed. and that is preventing agreement on a way forward for the Just Transition Work Program. So parties have been trying to decide what they're going to do when the Just Transition Work Program is over, and if it's going to be translated in something more permanent. But those draft decisions have not been agreed in the ESPs last year or in the COP. And so now, again, they should be considered in the SP 62 with an aim to have a draft decision for COP 30. There's more information on all of these in our Just Transition Explainer. The link is there, and we're updating it for this session. As I say, there's a relationship between response measures and Just Transition, but we covered that already. And now very quickly, quick update on loss and damage. As you might know, loss and damage also doesn't have an agreed concept or idea in the regime, but it's generally understood as those climate-related impacts that go beyond adaptation and include not just economic losses, but also non-economic losses. And the response in the regime is threefold, with the Warsaw Mechanism established in 2013, which is the main driver for action in regards to loss and damage. The Santiago Network catalyzing technical assistance established in 2019. And finally, the Loss and Damage Fund from 2023. And the negotiations during the last COP and now in the SBs are basically the review of the WIM, the Warsaw International Mechanism, which had an event at COP29 where they presented the report quite extensively, but the COP was not able to agree on how to react to that review. And so despite the terms of reference of the review being finalized at the previous SPs, still the review has not been finalized. Also because there's the joint annual report of the EXCOM, which is part of the WIM, and the Santiago Network, and parties did not agree if they wanted to react to both of them jointly or separately. So this will be covered by the SPs. And then I have a repeat of these two slides, and I will amend that before sharing it with you. On the global stocktake, Harrison already explained that this is a collective assessment of the implementation of the Paris Agreement, right? And so after it happened, the first global stocktake happened in Dubai, there were, of course, things to following actions or follow-up actions to consider. One of them that Harrison already explained is how parties are going to integrate what was in the GST in their NDCs. And so for that, they have the annual dialogue, which produces a report. There's also the question of how the COP or the CMA is going to integrate the GST outcome, not just how countries individually will do it in their NDCs, but what sort of measures will be taken collectively to integrate what was found there. And for that dialogue on implementing the GST outcomes at the international level, they were supposed to operationalize the dialogue at CMA 6 last year, but they didn't reach an agreement, so that went to Rule 16, same as all the other negotiations in regard to the GST. The annual dialogue that happened in Bonn last year produced a report, and the CMA was supposed to react to that report. Again, no agreement. This is related to the fact that some parties think that there shouldn't be any guidance towards their NDCs. And so that's why some parties here, they thought the report should only be noted but not commented, because that would imply some sort of guidance to the NDC, which are sovereign, according to their view. They're very strictly sovereign. So also Rule 16. And finally, what was supposed to be very simple is a review of how the last GST was in terms of process and what should be amended. And not even there, parties found agreement, as especially the consideration of IPCC reports and the timing of consideration of these scientific inputs was where some parties where parties found disagreement. But you can, so this will carry on also because of Rule 16, which means no agreement and then it's postponed to automatically to the next session. This will be discussed also in the SBs. On Article 6, very briefly, as we know, negotiations on 6.8 were completed at COP29. So instead of negotiations, we'll have mandated events, 2 sessions on 6.2, one ambition dialogue, one information session, and a workshop on non-market approaches so that you can consult here in this schedule when and where those are taking place. And finally, there's an interesting negotiation stream, interesting especially for us, where parties have been invited to submit their views on ways to increase the efficiency of the UNFCCC process, including streamlining the agendas of the SBs. But not only that, if we look at the country's submissions to this negotiation stream, they will go far beyond, because this idea of COPs being now too big or with too many negotiation streams and making the negotiations more difficult and making implementation of the agreement more difficult is an idea that is, of course, present in the negotiation teams as well. And so their suggestions for reform go beyond that point of streamlining the agendas. There's a very recent note by the Secretariat consolidating the views, but also showing some proposals for consideration of the SPs, which will consider this with a view to recommend a draft decision to COP30. That's it from our side. There are further resources there where, of course, available for questions if you wanted to go deeper in a certain topic, or if you need any resources that you can't find there. And I'm sorry that we took the whole hour, but please, if you have time to stick around a little bit for questions, we will stay still a couple of minutes answering your questions. So feel free to raise your hand or write them in the chat. I see someone clapping, but no questions. Thumbs up as well. More clapping. It's very generous. All right. I don't think there are any questions. We'll be looking forward to seeing you in Bonn if you're attending then. And yes, we leave it at that now. Yeah. All right. Thank you all very much for your kind comments, your attention, for being here. And yes, see you very soon.
Bye.